Hello and a very warm welcome to our bi-weekly edition of Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. On this week's programme, Israel's parliament swears in a new unity government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former rival Benny Gantz, bringing to an end a 508-day political deadlock. Covid-19, a number of Middle Eastern countries ease their restrictions as the infection rate slows. We take a close look at the impact of the pandemic on the region. Also coming up on our show this week, a conversation with Qatar's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Lolwah al Khater, about how the country has responded to the coronavirus crisis and fears concerning labour camps on the outskirts of Doha. Thank you for watching Middle East Matters. First, we start with Israel, where lawmakers have approved Benjamin Netanyahu's new unity government, ending more than a year of political deadlock. The embattled Prime Minister will be sharing the office with former rival Benny Gantz, and on top of his agenda, the controversial annexation of large parts of the West Bank.
It's been over 500 days, but finally Israeli politics can get back into gear. Both Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former rival Benny Gantz are to share power, presenting a united front in the face of the coronavirus pandemic.
ראינו את המגפה, ראינו את הסכנה, ולכן החלטנו יחד להסיט הצידה את המחלוקות בינינו ולהתייצב כתף אל כתף מול האתגרים הגדולים שמגפת הקורונה מציבה בפנינו.
With some 36 cabinet posts, it'll be Israel's largest government in its 82-year history. Netanyahu and Gantz even created new positions to a certain amount of opposition criticism just to find places for their own party loyalists. Former military chief Gantz's centrist blue and white coalition had previously failed to break deadlock at the polls 3 times in under a year.
מבקש לפנות אליך, אדוני ראש הממשלה. בכנות, כל אחד מאיתנו אולי היה מעדיף להרכיב ממשלה אחרת.
Netanyahu will keep his job as Prime Minister for the next 18 months, with Gantz then taking the reins for the same length of time. As alternate Prime Minister, Netanyahu will retain his immunity from having to resign, particularly as he faces trial over long-running corruption allegations that begins next week. Elsewhere, the government will have to hit the ground running. It wants to begin implementing a controversial US peace plan for the Middle East by July the 1st, one which would see it annex Jewish settlements and other Palestinian-administered territory in the West Bank.
Now, the Middle East is certainly no stranger to deadly viruses. The first case of MERS, a close relative of the respiratory disease SARS, was first reported in Saudi Arabia back in 2012. But is the COVID-19 death toll comparatively low in the region because these countries have learnt their lesson, or because, as some experts have suggested, numbers are intentionally or unintentionally being distorted?
Bustling streets in Amman as Jordanians flock to the markets and businesses reopen after almost 50 days of nationwide curfew. So far, the country's reported just over 600 cases of coronavirus and 9 deaths. Meanwhile, in Egypt, charity workers deliver food for those unable to earn an income during the lockdown. Breaching the nighttime curfew can carry a prison sentence. 12,000 people have been infected by the virus and over 600 have died. With 60% of inhabitants in the region under the age of 30, the early widespread testing and young population could explain how the Middle East has avoided a widespread outbreak. But what stands out most is how countries use different approaches according to their means.
Gulf countries have adopted a strategy of very aggressive testing early on. Jordan, Lebanon, and these countries, so the Orient, if you may. And the strategy has been to do lockdown measures early on because the testing capacity was not there to start with.
In an interview with France 24, Dr. Shadi Saleh specified that the accuracy of these reported figures also strongly depends on the availability of tests. And in war-torn regions where data is hard to collect, some populations remain at a higher risk.
More than 1/3 of the refugee population in the world resides in this region. And whenever you mix an infectious disease with a refugee situation where people are vulnerable, the living conditions are not ideal, then this is, a recipe for disaster.
Many fear that countries such as Yemen would be unable to handle a surge in cases. The country's already tackling the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and half of the health facilities are no longer functional.
Next to Qatar, where cases of the coronavirus were first reported back in February, within less than 2 months, those numbers grew to almost 30,000, and authorities, like elsewhere in the world, proceeded to impose a nationwide lockdown, keeping the death toll to under 20. But the country has had very specific challenges of its own. One of them is the potential outbreak in the capital's prison, as well as its labour camps. Now, for more on this story, let's bring in Qatar's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Lolwah al Khater. Your Excellency, I'd like to welcome you back to the programme. Now, you are on the Supreme Committee for Crisis Management, in this case dealing with this global pandemic. Can you briefly talk us through the measures that you've implemented throughout the country to contain the spread of COVID-19?
Very happy to be with you again, Salam. As you rightly pointed, we have one of the lowest fatality rates globally. It's around 15 cases. 0.04% basically. Measures include converting completely to e-learning, campaigns in 9 different languages. Qatar is a very multicultural country, as you know, reducing the workforce in both private and public sector to 20%, in addition to shutting most of the economic activities, with the exception of banking systems, our sector, as well as the food and medicine shops and stores. Inbound flights have been suspended since March as well.
Now, Your Excellency, we are fast approaching the 3-year anniversary of the Saudi-led blockade on Qatar. Can you tell us what kind of an impact this has had on your country's efforts to tackle this crisis?
Ironically enough, the blockade has actually prepared us for such an event. To give you one example, in terms of the food security index, Qatar is 13 globally and number 1 in the region. So it has actually prepared us. Now, the second part of my answer has to do with our global efforts to help other countries. Qatar has helped repatriate around 1 million passengers back to their countries, including 100,000 to the UK, 75,000 or 70,000 to Germany, 45,000 to France. So the problem is with the airspace restrictions by United Arab Emirates, Saudi, and Bahrain. This makes our flights longer and it costs us much more.
Now I'd like to move on to the situation of migrant workers, if we can, who make up 95% of the labour force, who, according to many rights groups, are already living in very, very poor conditions. What measures have you put in place for them during this crisis?
Every individual in Qatar has the same access right to health services. And our motto in this pandemic has been, my safety is your safety. And this includes our colleagues, the blue-collar workers. We have purpose-built hospitals closer to their accommodations, quarantine facilities that have been developed. We're working very closely with their embassies also to raise awareness in 9 different languages, as I mentioned.
Your Excellency, you mentioned that yet the World Bank has spoken very strongly of the overcrowding, often 10 or more men living in one space. In addition to that, I'd like to know what you're doing to help these migrant workers whose contracts have been terminated, or some of them have been placed on unpaid leave. The Guardian newspaper reporting that some of them, unable to return home, are actually begging for food.
I don't think that this represents the reality. It actually misrepresents the reality. The facts are the following. We have a fund dedicated for blue-collar workers. If their companies, for whatever reason, for economic difficulties, for example, cannot pay them, this fund does pay them. We have thousands of meals being provided through Red Crescent and Qatar Charity to guest or blue-collar workers as well. Salam, let's be realistic. This pandemic was not expected by anyone. Many businesses globally are being out of business, basically. And we're trying to work very closely with the embassies, as I mentioned, to which those blue-collar workers belong.
So, Your Excellency, just to be very clear and to leave on this note, I've been reading through some 20 testimonies of the workers saying that they haven't been given free food or accommodation. You're saying these are wholly inaccurate?
If those are accurate, those are 20 cases, and we have around 1.5 million blue-collar workers. So basically, this is not acceptable for anyone not to receive adequate, let's say, services or food. And if those cases are brought to us and to the respective authorities, their companies are actually being punished. So this is absolutely not acceptable, but you're talking about 20 cases out of 1.5 million blue-collar workers living in Qatar.
Hopefully next time we speak, we'll see 0 cases. Qatar's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Lolwah al Khater, I'd like to thank you for speaking to us here on Middle East Matters. Now, have you been making the most of your time at home during the lockdown, fitting in a Zoom meeting alongside a banana bread baking session, or sitting on your couch and binge watching television shows? Well, if you fall into the latter group, you're not alone. Streaming services like Netflix have added 15 million new subscribers, and over in Turkey, it's no different. Dizies, those are Turkish TV shows, are now more popular than ever before, and one of those shows is still being produced on a weekly basis.
This film crew looks like it's coming right out of a science fiction movie.
Birimiz kayda giriyor, açığı kontrol ediyor, ondan sonra uzak yani. Birimiz kapının önünde duruyor, birimiz de. Kayıttayız.
Merhaba Cemile teyze, ne haber, ne yapıyorsun?
Today, the actress is performing in her own apartment. The characters in the show are in confinement, just like in real life.
Her şeyi berbat edeyim. İzleyici bu kısımda çok önemli. Onları bu durumda yalnız bırakmamak için, evlerinde en azından misafir olabilmek için. Aslında yani şu süreçte birlik olabilmek için. Yoksa hepimiz diğer dizi setleri gibi tabii ki de durabilirdik.
In this scene, Kubra Gümüş's character is pretending to plead with her unrequited lover. Tutunamayanlar, Turkish for Disconnected, is a comedy that started airing in January. Just a few weeks into the show, the coronavirus forced production to change gears. New sets were improvised, and to avoid having too many people together at once, a new tool appeared, this robot camera, piloted from afar.
Yönetmenimiz, görüntü yönetmenimiz ve yönetmen yardımcımız evlerindeyiz diyor şu anda. Sistem gayet iyi. Diziyi yaklaşık normalde 80 kişi giden işi sahadaki 4 arkadaşla çekebiliyoruz. Yaklaşık 1-1,5 yıl daha bu sistemin devam edeceğini düşünüyorum. İnsanlar yavaş yavaş adapte olacak. Set ekiplerinin sayısı düşecektir mutlaka.
Aynı, birebir.
And it works. The sitcom is making a name for itself in the very competitive world of Turkish TV shows, second only to US shows in terms of global outreach.
Well, that's it from us this week. Stay safe.